Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Today we'll talk about how to lean for takeoff with high-density altitude. Why? Because the way you lean for takeoff varies considerably depending upon the type of aircraft you're flying and the engine instrumentation you have in your aircraft. And because it could apply to you even if you're taking off from an airport as low as 1,500 feet above sea level. Also, this is a shorter than usual episode because it's a follow-up to episode 196, in which we talked with Colin Arrow about mountain flying and high-density altitude. But we didn't talk about how to lean an aircraft for takeoff when it's high, hot, or humid. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out. At the end of the show, I'll share some of my thoughts about two recent accidents, one which killed my friend CFI Mary Ellen Carlin a couple of weeks ago, and the other involving a jet crashing at Truckee, California a few days ago. Also, I have a quick announcement about a very short hiring window that just opened for applying to be an air traffic controller with the FAA, but you have only a couple of days to apply. If you haven't done so already, please click on the subscribe button or the follow button in whatever app you're hearing me on. Then click the share button, those three dots on the Apple Podcast app if you're using that app, and share the show with a friend. Thanks again for your support. First off, I wanted to let you know there's an extremely short window in which you or someone you know can apply to become an FAA air traffic controller. My thanks to listener Daniel Ruiz for posting this announcement on a Facebook group, which is where I first noticed it. The window opens today, July 30th, 2021, but closes in 3 days on Monday, August the 2nd. According to the FAA.gov website, each year the FAA has a short window for any eligible U.S. citizen to apply to the open announcement. The FAA's controller workforce reached 14,242 last year in fiscal 2020, and the FAA hired 920 new controllers last year in 2020, and they plan to hire more than 4,300 controllers over the next 5 years. The FAA provides a robust training program to new controllers that includes air traffic basic training and training at the FAA Academy in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Following graduation from the FAA Academy and based on staffing needs, ATC trainees are assigned to an FAA facility for additional training. A certified controller can attain a six-figure salary and receive a comprehensive federal benefits package. The application window is open to all eligible U.S. citizens July 30th to August 2nd, 2021. Interested individuals can learn more about eligibility requirements at faa.gov/levelup. That's LEVELUP. And I went out to that site, and here are the minimum requirements they list. You must be a U.S. citizen. You must be age 30 or less on the closing date of the application, so you can't have turned 31 by August 2nd. You must pass a medical examination, pass a security investigation, pass the FAA air traffic pre-employment test, speak English, have 3 years of progressive responsible work experience or a bachelor's degree or a combination of post-secondary education and work experience that totals 3 years, and be willing to locate to an FAA facility based on agency staffing needs. So these are great jobs, and I'm guessing even if you're not interested in the job, you might know a young person who might be, so please pass this information along. Of course, I will include links in the show notes. Now let's jump right into how to lean for takeoff with high-density altitude. First, if you live near sea level, you might be thinking, why should I care about this? I live near sea level, I never land at high-altitude airports, so high-density altitude doesn't apply to me, and I don't need to remember to lean for takeoff under high-density altitude conditions. And yes, if you always fly out of airports at sea level, you probably will never have to lean before takeoff because of high-density altitude. But people learn to fly because they want to go places, and many of those places are above sea level. Lycoming says, quote, for 5,000-foot density altitude and above or high ambient temperatures, roughness or reduction of power may occur at full rich mixture. The mixture may be adjusted to obtain smooth engine operation. And the POH for a Cessna 172R, that's the current model, says you should lean whenever you're above 3,000-foot pressure altitude for maximum RPM. I wanted to figure out how low an airport might be and still have a 5,000-foot density altitude. So I just ran a calculation using an E6B app on my phone. That's from Sporties, by the way. First, I used 40 degrees C, which is 104 degrees Fahrenheit, as you can reach that temperature in most states in the U.S. and many countries around the world. Standard pressure is 29.92, so I used 29.6, which is not unusually low, and which you undoubtedly could encounter someday in your real-world flying. Then I looked to see what altitude I'd need to get a 5,000-foot density altitude under those conditions, and the answer was surprisingly low. A field elevation of just 1,500 feet with a temperature of 40 degrees C and a pressure setting of 29.6 gives you 5,000-foot density altitude, and in many aircraft, you'll be needing to lean your engine prior to takeoff from that airport. Now that you know that leaning for takeoff will probably be relevant for you on some days at some airports, let's quickly review the factors that affect density altitude. First, you want to remember that high density altitude corresponds to reduced air density and thus to reduced aircraft performance. There are three factors that contribute to high density altitude, which you can remember as being high, hot, and or humid. Altitude, which is the first one. The higher the altitude, the less dense the air. At airports and higher elevations, high temperatures sometimes have an effect on density altitude that makes safe operations impossible. In such conditions, operating after mid-morning can become extremely hazardous. Even at lower elevations, aircraft performance can become marginal, and it may be necessary to reduce gross weight for safe operations. And as we've seen, you could encounter these conditions at airports at just 1,500 feet above sea level. Temperature. The warmer the air, the less dense it is. When the temperature rises above the standard temperature for a particular place, the density of the air in that location is reduced and density altitude increases. Therefore, it's advisable when performance is in question to schedule operations during the cool hours of the day, such as early morning or late afternoon or evening. Humidity. Humidity has less of an impact than temperature, but higher humidity does reduce aircraft performance. Anytime the temperature and dew point are relatively close together, you have very high humidity. The FAA says in their density altitude publication that, quote, if high humidity does exist, however, it is wise to add 10% to your computed takeoff distance and anticipate a reduced climb rate. Now, unfortunately, most POHs don't include humidity in their performance tables, so you can't easily figure out how much performance you'll lose when you have high humidity. I did find a paper on the subject written by an Embry-Riddle student, which includes some rules of thumb for how much humidity impacts aircraft performance, and I'll include a link to that paper in the show notes. By the way, in researching this topic, I came across an article written by my friend Steve Ells. He wrote for the CessnaFlyer.org website, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes. He said, pilots sometimes hear opinions that leaning burns exhaust valves and that fuel is less costly than a top overhaul. Based on these convictions, they may conclude that leaning is bad. However, real-world testing of engines in what's probably the world's most sophisticated aircraft engine test cell have proven those claims to be false. The main reason you should learn to lean correctly is to maintain the health of your engine. A second reason is to save money. Since air density decreases as we climb above sea level, mixtures go richer. Savvy pilots lean for takeoff when the density altitude is greater than 3,000 feet. Notice Steve says lean above a density altitude greater than 3,000 feet. Lycoming says above 5,000 foot density altitude. So where does the 3,000 foot density altitude come from? Remember that I said that the POH for Cessna 172R POH says you should lean whenever you're above 3,000 feet pressure altitude. But I think they probably meant density altitude. Why? Because density altitude changes relatively little for changes in pressure altitude, but it changes a lot for changes in temperature. And what your engine cares about is density altitude, not pressure altitude. So it's entirely possible that Cessna meant you should lean above 3,000 foot density altitude, which would make more sense. Regardless, you should follow the leaning guidance you find for your specific aircraft. Now, the methods you'll use for leaning will be very different depending upon the aircraft type you're flying, which is why we're doing this show. Let's talk first about some of the exceptions to the general rule of leaning before takeoff in high-density altitude. In these aircraft, you should never lean before takeoff, regardless of the density altitude. The first exception is for turbocharged aircraft. These aircraft generate sea-level power all the way up to the critical altitude, which is often above 20,000 feet. So the engine always thinks it's at sea level, regardless of the density altitude. So for these aircraft, you generally don't lean them before takeoff. Of course, there's an exception to the exception. Years ago, I was partners in a Cessna T210, which was turbocharged. And what I learned during the 3-day course I took at the Cessna Pilots Association was that depending upon how a mechanic has set up the fuel flow in your engine, you might need to lean slightly before takeoff, even at a sea-level airport. Now, here's why. If the mechanic has set up the fuel flow so the engine doesn't overboost on a nice cool day at sea level, you're not going to have the amount of fuel flow you need and manifold pressure you need for taking off on a really hot day. So sometimes a mechanic will set up a richer fuel flow that guarantees you have the fuel flow you need on a hot day. However, that fuel flow will be a little too rich for takeoff at sea level on a cool day. So if your engine has been set up that way, on a cool day, you may have to pull back slightly on the throttle before takeoff so the engine doesn't exceed its maximum manifold pressure, and you might also have to pull back slightly on the mixture control so that the mixture doesn't exceed its target fuel flow. So this is an exception where you might have to do a small amount of leaning in a turbocharged aircraft, but generally speaking, you don't have to lean a turbocharged aircraft at all for takeoff when operating in high-density altitude conditions. Another exception is for any normally aspirated aircraft that has an altitude compensating fuel pump, because in these aircraft, the fuel pump automatically reduces the fuel flow during the climb. Now, the only aircraft I know with an altitude compensating fuel pump are the Cirrus SR20s that were built prior to 2017. You do not need to lean these aircraft prior to takeoff at high-density altitude, and you also don't need to lean them in a climb. One thing to note, though, is that the altitude compensating fuel pump does this automatic leaning only at full throttle. So you still need to lean these aircraft once you're in cruise, and you also need to lean them when you're on the ground before and after takeoff. In 2017, Cirrus introduced the SR20 G6 model, which has a different engine, and that engine does need to be leaned prior to takeoff or high-density altitude, and we'll talk about the specifics for that model later in the show. Now let's talk about the most general case for leaning prior to takeoff, which applies to the vast majority of aircraft, and that's for people who are flying a normally aspirated engine, so one that's not turbocharged, with a fixed pitch prop. So the Cessna 172 would fall into this category, as would aircraft in which you might learn to fly. For these aircraft, leaning is relatively simple. Let's refer to the Cessna 172R POH again. If you look at checklists for both normal takeoff and short field takeoff, they both say, quote, mixture control rich above 3,000 feet pressure altitude, lean for maximum RPM. And in the amplified procedures section, it says, quote, prior to takeoff from fields above 3,000 feet pressure altitude, the mixture should be leaned to give maximum RPM at full throttle with the aircraft not moving. So that means during your run-up, you're going to have to step on the brakes really hard, set full throttle, and then lean the mixture control until you reach the maximum RPM. Now, one source I read said that you might want to enrich it slightly from there, as it said that the engine produces slightly less power during a static run-up than it will during the takeoff roll. So you'll need a slightly higher fuel flow during the takeoff roll than you need while doing a full power static run-up. Also, a slightly higher fuel flow will probably help cool the engine. The 172R POH also says, quote, full throttle run-ups over loose gravel are especially harmful to propeller tips. When takeoffs must be made over a gravel surface, advance the throttle slowly. This allows the airplane to start rolling before high RPM is developed, and the gravel will be blown behind the propeller rather than pulled into it. So if the run-up area is full of gravel, instead of doing a full power static run-up that might suck gravel into your prop, you might instead consider leaning the mixture during your takeoff roll. Now, frankly, I'm not a huge fan of adjusting the mixture while you're rolling down the runway, as there are other things you need to concentrate on. But there may be situations where you feel you need to do just that. So leaning before takeoff with a fixed pitch prop is relatively easy, as you're just looking for maximum RPM. Now, things become a little more complicated if you're leaning a normally aspirated engine with a constant speed prop, such as the Cessna 182. Let me take a moment to explain the difference between a fixed pitch prop like the ones you'll find on a 172 and the constant speed prop found on a 182 and many other higher performance aircraft. You can think of a fixed pitch prop as being carved out of a large block of aluminum. It's a simple design with no moving parts, and the angle of the blade never changes. That angle is fixed, and hence it's called a fixed pitch prop. It's also the least expensive type of prop and has lower overall performance, which is why it's found most often on lower cost aircraft and on typical training aircraft. By contrast, a constant speed prop has a number of moving parts. The most important of these are the propeller blades, which can be rotated along their long axis to change the blade pitch. Why would you want to change the pitch? Because you'll want a high RPM for maximum takeoff power, but in cruise you'll want to make your engine more fuel efficient by increasing the blade angle, which reduces the RPM. There are a couple of variations of this type of prop. A controllable pitch propeller is one where the pitch is controlled manually by the pilot, but more commonly aircraft use a constant speed propeller that automatically changes its blade pitch to maintain a constant RPM, regardless of the amount of engine torque being produced or the airspeed or altitude at which the aircraft is flying. The RPM is set by the prop governor, which is controlled by the prop knob. In a Cessna 182, the prop knob is a rotating vernier control, similar to the mixture control in newer Cessnas, but while the mixture knob in a 182 is red, the prop control is blue. Now, if you've ever tried to lean a Cessna 182 prior to takeoff in high-density altitude conditions in the same way you might lean a 172 by leaning for a maximum RPM at full throttle, you'll find it's an exercise in futility, as the prop governor keeps the prop at a constant RPM, and its speed doesn't change as you lean the mixture at full power. So we need to lean it in a different way. Yet here's a direct quote from the Cessna 182 TPOH, which is the latest model. It says, prior to takeoff from fields above 5,000 feet pressure altitude, the mixture should be leaned to give maximum RPM at full throttle with the airplane not moving. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not going to work, as you'll get the same RPM over a wide range of mixture settings. You might also think, well, the 182 has a manifold pressure gauge, but I can tell you from experience years ago that also doesn't work, as manifold pressure also remains relatively constant as you adjust the mixture on the ground at full throttle. Fortunately, the POH gives better guidance in the performance tables in Section 5. If you look in the notes sections at the bottom of the short field takeoff chart, it says, quote, prior to takeoff, the mixture should be leaned to the maximum power fuel flow schedule in a full throttle static run-up. This maximum power fuel flow schedule is referenced in several other of the performance charts as well, including the maximum rate of climb and the time, fuel, and distance to climb charts. And where do you find this maximum power fuel flow schedule? Well, it's in a totally different section, of course. In the Cessna 182 TPOH, if you go to Section 4, Normal Procedures, and look for the Amplified Procedures, under En route climb, you'll find the maximum power fuel flow table. Also, the table appears as a placard in the aircraft engraved into the instrument panel just behind where your right hand would be on the pilot's yoke. For the 182, fuel flows are listed for sea level and then every 2,000 feet up to 12,000 feet. For example, at sea level, the maximum power fuel flow is 20.5 gallons, and it decreases until it reaches just 13.5 gallons per hour at 12,000 feet. By the way, the Cirrus SR20 also has a similar table, and it's also a placard in the aircraft, so you won't have to look it up in the POH. That table is so simple, I've memorized the first few altitudes and fuel flows, which are 27 gallons at sea level, 24 gallons at 4,000 feet, 21 gallons at 8,000 feet, and so on. Above 8,000 feet, I would need to look at the table. The tables, by the way, are useful not only for setting the mixture prior to takeoff, but you can also use them to lean the engine as you climb through these altitudes. But not all aircraft POHs have a maximum power fuel flow table. So in these aircraft with constant speed propellers, you're going to have to use a different method to lean before takeoff. First, check your POH to see if it has a recommended method for leaning the engine prior to takeoff. If it doesn't have a procedure, then you may want to use one of the alternative methods of leaning that my friend Rod Machado talks about in one of his videos. And of course, I'll include a link to his video in the show notes. The first method Rod recommends, which he also describes as the least precise method, is to do a full throttle run-up before takeoff and lean the engine until it sounds like it's producing maximum power. Then leave the mixture at that setting and use it when you take off. In the climb out, he says you should make small adjustments to produce the maximum power based on sound. The next method works if you have an electronic engine monitor, such as a GEM or JPI device. These show the EGTs for every cylinder in the airplane. During the run-up, lean for maximum EGT, which would be exhaust gas temperature, and then enrich the mixture by about 75 to 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Rod recommends that you use the first cylinder to reach peak as your reference, not the last cylinder to reach peak. You could also try this method in an older aircraft that has only a single EGT gauge. Those gauges monitor the EGT of just a single cylinder, and in these aircraft, there's no way to tell if you're monitoring the first or the last cylinder to peak or one of the ones in between. So your leaning of the engine will be slightly less accurate than if you have an engine monitor that monitors all of the cylinders. But still, it's probably a better method of leaning the engine than just listening to the sound. Here are some other suggestions for leaning from other sources. AdvancedPilot.com has a short presentation that talks about identifying a target EGT that you can use during all takeoffs and climbs from any airport at any altitude. To identify the target EGT, take off from an airport that's near sea level with a mixture full rich. Soon after takeoff, when you're within, say, 1,000 feet of the ground, note the engine EGT. That then becomes your target EGT. Then, before taking off from an airport with high-density altitude, do a full power run-up on the ground and lean the mixture to the target Egt value that you've identified taking off at sea level. Then take off with that mixture setting. As you climb from any airport at any altitude, gradually lean the mixture during the climb so that you can maintain approximately the same EGT throughout the climb. Finally, always in a climb, you need to monitor your CHT or cylinder head temperatures to make sure they don't become too hot in the climb. This is true when taking off from any airport at any temperature, but it's especially important on hot days when you're flying in thinner air, as the air will be less effective in cooling the engine. Different aircraft manufacturers have different target CHT recommendations. In general, I like to keep CHTs below 380 degrees, and if possible, never let them exceed 400 degrees. If your CHTs are rising, you have only a few options available to you for stopping the temperature rise. The easiest solution is to lower the nose to reduce your rate of climb, which will increase your airspeed. That increased airspeed will increase the airflow over your engine, which increases the total amount of cooling. That in turn will decrease your CHTs, but it doesn't happen instantaneously, so be patient. Another option for reducing CHTs is to enrich in the mixture. Of course, if you're already at full rich mixture, that option isn't available to you. Also, at high density altitudes, eventually you can enrich in the mixture so much that the engine will start to run rough because of excessive fuel. In the extreme, the engine could quit. So you can see that there are limits to how much you can enrich in the mixture to cool the CHTs. Now, if your aircraft has cowl flaps, such as a Cessna 182 or a 206, make sure that the cowl flaps are fully open during the climb. If the cowl flaps are only partially open, you will have higher CHTs. There's one thing you don't want to do to reduce rising CHTs, even though it may seem logical. Do not reduce the engine power. A lot of pilots think, hey, if I'm using less power on the climb, there will be less heat in the engine. But what they don't realize is that the full power setting on many engines puts a lot of extra fuel in the engine, and during a climb, that extra fuel cools the engine. If you reduce the power, you'll reduce the amount of extra fuel available for cooling the engine. So please don't pull the throttle or don't lean the mixture to try and cool the engine if the temperatures are too hot. Now, there is one exception to this. Some aircraft POHs support a lean of peak climb power setting. In those aircraft, if you were doing a lean of peak climb, reducing the fuel flow would actually reduce the heat in the engine. And you do that by reducing the mixture. However, in some of these aircraft, I found that if the CHTs are rising during a lean of peak climb, that a better solution is just to increase the mixture and do a normal rich of peak climb, as the extra fuel seems to do a better job of cooling the engine and you'll have more power available. And now let's get back to the SR20 G6 for people who happen to be flying one of those aircraft which was produced in 2017 and later. These aircraft do not have an altitude compensating fuel pump, so you will need to lean these aircraft prior to takeoff in high density altitude, and you will need to lean them in the climb. Leaning these aircraft is incredibly simple for a takeoff or in climb. On the fuel flow display, a green rectangle is displayed. If you set the mixture so that the white pointer points at the top of the green rectangle, you've properly set the mixture for takeoff and for climb. Or you can set the mixture per the maximum fuel flow table, which shows that at sea level you need 20 gallons per hour, at 14,000 feet 18 gallons per hour, 8,000 feet with 16 gallons per hour, and at 12,000 feet just 15 gallons per hour. So in summary, there are a wide variety of ways to adjust the mixture prior to takeoff in high density altitude conditions. Remember, there are a few exceptions, such as turbocharged aircraft and older Cirrus SR20 models, where you always take off with a mixture set full rich. But in most aircraft, you need to adjust the mixture prior to takeoff in high density altitude conditions. There are a variety of ways to do that in different aircraft, and to start, you should look at the POH for your aircraft to see what method it recommends. If it doesn't recommend a specific method, then you may want to use one of the methods discussed here. Coming up next, I'll talk about some recent aircraft accidents, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let's talk about the crash that occurred a couple of weeks ago that killed a CFI friend of mine who gave me my high-altitude endorsement in the accident aircraft. The NTSB has released a preliminary report, and I'll read now from that to give you a little background. On July 13th, 2021, about 10:42 Pacific Daylight Time, a Cessna 421C was destroyed when it was involved in an accident near Monterey, California. The pilot and passengers were fatally injured. The airplane was operated under Part 91. Review of recorded communications from the Monterey Air Traffic Control Tower revealed that the pilot canceled their initial IFR clearance and requested a VFR on top clearance. The controller subsequently issued a VFR on top clearance via the Monterey 5 departure procedure, which included instructions to turn left after takeoff to join the Salinas VOR 264-degree radial. The controller issued a clearance for takeoff and shortly after instructed the pilot to contact Oakland Center. Review of recorded communications with Oakland Center revealed that the pilot established radio communication as the aircraft ascended through 1,700 feet MSL. The controller noticed that the airplane was turning in the wrong direction and issued an immediate right turn to a heading of 030, which was acknowledged by the pilot. The controller then immediately issued 2 low-altitude alerts with no response from the pilot. No further radio communications were received. Recorded ADS-B data provided by the FAA showed that the airplane departed from runway 10 right at 1738 Zulu and ascended to 1,075 feet MSL before a right turn was initiated. The data showed that at 1740, the airplane continued to ascend in a right turn and reached an altitude of 2,000 feet before a descent began. The data show that the airplane continued descending in a right turn until contact was lost at 1740 and 38 seconds Zulu at an altitude of 775 feet, about 520 feet southwest of the accident site. The report includes Figure 1, which is a satellite view of the area around the Monterey Airport, and the ADS-B ground track is superimposed on the image. It shows an initial straight-out climb and then a turn to the right. About halfway through the turn tightens so that the radius is about half of what it was during the first part of the turn. That suggests that the pilot increased the bank angle after being told she was turning the wrong way and was told to continue the turn to the right to a heading of 030. There is very high terrain to the right of the runway, which is why the departure procedure calls for an initial left turn. Now, I would have thought that the controller might have instructed her to stop the right turn and turn left back to the correct heading and away from higher terrain to the right, but I really don't think that was a factor. The aircraft was climbing well, and the controller probably determined that it was safe to continue the turn to the right, even though it was toward higher terrain. Had the aircraft continued to climb properly, there shouldn't have been an accident. However, in the turn, the aircraft began a descent, losing about 1,200 feet, and eventually striking lower terrain. By the way, the aircraft only turned a total of about 300 degrees from the time it took off until it crashed, so it was less than a full 360-degree turn. Now, when I first heard about the crash, it seemed absolutely impossible to me that it could have been pilot error. My friend had been a CFI for many years and had also owned and operated the 421C for a long time. Hence, I first thought that there must have been some type of mechanical failure, either of her instruments or of an engine. It's always hard to imagine that a good pilot would make a fatal mistake, but of course the accident record is full of cases of excellent pilots making fatal mistakes, and I think it's likely that this accident will be eventually chalked up to pilot error. At first, I couldn't understand how a CFI could end up taking off and making a wrong turn toward higher terrain. But with the passage of a few weeks and an examination of the chart for the Monterey 5 departure, I see how it could have happened. As background, it's important to know that the Monterey Airport is close to the Pacific Ocean, and departures off of 28 left and 28 right fly right out over the ocean. You've undoubtedly heard of a sea breeze. That's the wind that generally blows from the water to the land during the daytime. So aircraft landing or taking off during the daytime almost always land and take off on runway 28 left and 28 right. At night, there's a land breeze and the winds reverse. So as the sun goes down, the wind shifts, and aircraft landing at Monterey at night or in the early morning hours usually land on 10 left or 10 right. And this doesn't just happen on the West Coast. When visiting my in-laws in Florida, I used to watch arrivals and departures at Palm Beach International follow the same reversal of the landing pattern almost every night. I think it's fair to say that for GA aircraft landing and taking off at Monterey, over 90% of their landings and takeoffs are to runways 28 left and 28 right, and they rarely use 10 left and 10 right. And when you use runways 28 left and 28 right, virtually every takeoff involves an initial turn to the right. For example, if you fly the Monterey 5 departure from these runways, your initial heading is a right turn to 329. If you fly an instrument approach to 28 left, the missed approaches all turn to the right. And if you were to get alternate missed instructions when flying an instrument approach, they will be a turn to 330, climb to 3000. So it's fair to say that if you're virtually always using runways 28 left and 28 right, all of your initial turns will always be to the right. Interestingly, after the crash, I pulled out the chart for the Monterey 5 departure. I was initially confused about that first turn to be made when departing on runway 10 right, which is the runway that's rarely used and the one which my CFI friend was departing from. My first reaction was, huh? The departure shows an initial turn to the right. And my next reaction, of course, was, well, that can't be because there's high terrain to the right. I then started looking at the runway orientation, and that didn't look right, which I found confusing on the chart. At Monterey, 10 left, which is on the north side of the field, is a very short runway, while 10 right on the south side of the field is a very long runway. Yet as I looked at the chart, I couldn't map the orientation of the runways on the chart to my knowledge of the Monterey airport. It probably took me at least 20 seconds to figure out what was wrong, which was surprising since I know the Monterey airport well and I'm teaching IFR there all the time. The Monterey 5 departure chart is drawn with a north-up orientation, which is what you'd expect. But somehow when I was visualizing the airport in my mind, I was visualizing it with a south-up orientation, so everything was reversed. And why might I have done that? Well, I live about 60 miles north of the airport, and when I fly to it, I'm always approaching it from the north. Hence my mental picture of the airport is a south-up orientation. Also, it's virtually impossible to approach the airport from the south because the airport is near sea level, but immediately south of the airport, the mountains rise to over 6,000 feet. So very few people ever approach that airport directly from the south. So I was stunned at how I initially misread the chart and saw incorrectly an initial turn-off runway 10 right to the right. But I knew intuitively that that had to be wrong, as everyone knows about the 6,000-foot mountains to the south. So if I could make a mistake misreading the chart, I'm sure my friend could have also made a mistake and turned to the right. But often in aviation, a first mistake gets compounded by a second mistake, which ultimately leads to what's known as the accident chain of errors, as rarely does a single mistake lead to an accident. In this case, it's obvious that my friend, when she learned from the controller that she should have turned to the left instead of the right, tightened up her turn to the right to avoid the terrain to the south. This in itself shouldn't have been a problem, but whenever you increase the turn radius by steepening the bank, less of your lift vector is oriented vertically. To compensate for that, pilots know that when you go into a turn, you have to pull back more on the yoke, otherwise the aircraft will descend. And if you make a really steep turn, you may have to pull back really hard on the yoke to keep the aircraft from descending. The data from this accident shows that as the turn steepened, the aircraft stopped climbing and started to descend, and the airspeed increased. In this case, the aircraft went from climbing at about 1,500 feet per minute to descending at 2,900 feet per minute. At the peak of its climb, the aircraft was only about 1,200 feet AGL above the accident site, and at a 2,900 foot per minute descent rate, it only takes 25 seconds to reach the ground. Now, could this accident have happened some other way, perhaps by mechanical failure? Yeah, absolutely. But it seems more plausible that this was pilot error, starting initially with a turn in the wrong direction. Sadly, if it had been a clear day, I don't think this accident would have happened, because even if the pilot had turned the wrong way and started descending as she tightened the turn, she would have had instant visual feedback that she was descending and would have pulled back harder. But most of this flight was in the clouds, as the tops were reported earlier in the day as being at 2,000 feet. Since clouds generally rise as they're heated, they were probably a little higher than that, and the maximum altitude the aircraft reached was 2,000 feet. Cloud bases were reported at 800 feet AGL, just slightly above the terrain at the accident site. So a bad situation which could easily be recognized and resolved if you're in VMC can often turn fatal in IMC, as it may take longer to recognize the situation. What I'd like you to take away from this is that all pilots make mistakes, even very experienced pilots, and yes, even flight instructors. For example, earlier today, I was flying with an instrument student who's just about to take his check ride. While he performed well in almost all aspects of the flight, he made one mistake that could have been fatal if he had been flying a different approach and I hadn't caught the mistake. The mistake was that he started descending to the MDA of the approach about 4 miles before we reached the final approach fix where that descent should have begun. Fortunately, we were over the ocean and there were no obstacles below. I think that error occurred because the controller vectored us onto the final approach outside the intermediate fix and an altitude that was lower than it would have been had we started at an IAF. After crossing the intermediate fix, I believe my client figured, hey, it's time to go down, but we were already at the altitude for that next segment. Often, but not always, when you fly an approach, there's a new lower altitude available for each segment of an approach. But in this case, as we crossed into the next segment, we were already at the desired altitude and weren't permitted to descend any further, but descend he did. As a pilot, you know there are lots of little gotchas that can get you into trouble, and this pilot learned a new one today. Sadly, not everyone gets a second chance. There was also a crash a couple of days ago of a Bombardier Challenger 605 jet at the Truckee, California airport near Lake Tahoe. That crash surprised me, as it seems to me that most business jet accidents occur after an unstable approach to a landing when the jet runs off the end of the runway. In this case, the jet was flying an instrument approach to runway 20, and the pilot announced to the tower that he would be circling to runway 11 since he needed a longer runway. The jet announced that he had the airport in sight and then started a slight turn to the right for a left base entry to runway 11. However, the aircraft crashed short of the runway and slightly south of the runway, suggesting that the aircraft may have overshot the base to final turn. One eyewitness, a golfer, said that he saw one wing down and the nose down as the aircraft crashed into the trees. Eyewitness reports are not always reliable, but it's entirely possible that while correcting for an overshoot from base to final, the aircraft had a stall spin accident. Weather at the time was reported to be variable from 3.5 to 5 mile visibility, smoke and broken clouds at 2,300 feet above the airport. The next weather report an hour later said thunderstorms in the vicinity. The smoke, of course, was from a nearby wildfire. So smoke and poor visibility may have been a factor. Interestingly, one pilot on Facebook reported that he and his crew had diverted earlier in the day from Truckee to the nearby Reno airport, and they were driving back to Truckee when they witnessed the accident. So again, no way to know what happened for sure, but it does highlight the risk of circling approaches, especially in limited visibility or at night. I always avoid circling approaches whenever possible. In general, I'd prefer to land with a slight tailwind, provided there was enough runway, to avoid having to circle, especially at night. And we should all remember that the option to divert always exists. I can think of at least 4 weather-related diversions I've done in a Vision Jet over the last 18 months. So when you have poor conditions at an airport, you should always consider diverting. Well, I hope you found at least one nugget of information you could take away from this show. That's always my goal, is to provide depth of information so that all pilots, regardless of experience, will learn at least one thing that's useful during each of our shows. And by the way, if you found value in the show, think about what you might pay to rent an aircraft for an hour or to pay a flight instructor for an hour of instruction. And then consider supporting the show with an hour's worth of support. Just 3 to 4% of listeners donate to the show. And every month we lose a few of them because their credit cards expire and they don't go to update them. So we're constantly looking for new supporters. And signing up is easy. All you need to do is go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and enter your credit card information. You can also support the show through PayPal, where you have a choice of donating monthly or making a one-time lump sum donation. And to donate via PayPal, go to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. With either of those options, you don't need any special kind of account. You can just sign up by entering your credit card information at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or /PayPal. And thank you so much for your support. And finally, please tell all of your friends about the Aviation News Talk podcast. Just click on that share button and send them this episode. And if your friend doesn't know what a podcast is, send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, where they can download our dedicated app for free. Just search in the store for Aviation News Talk. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.